Hi, I'm Lavelle Porter from Big Onion Walking Tours for Destination Harlem TV. So Harlem is famously known as an African-American community. And to really put the significance of Harlem in context, we'll have to talk about the history of African-Americans in New York City. The first black community began to form in the early 1800s. And this was in Lower Manhattan, near where the City Hall and courthouse areas are now. And in the 1800s, that was a neighborhood known as the 5 Points. So named because of three intersecting streets that created a kind of 5-point star that was the center of that neighborhood. And people who lived in the 5 Points in the early 1800s were people who were on the lowest rungs of society. And at this time, many of them were free blacks. And by the 1840s, many Irish immigrants began to come over and settle into the 5 Points. And we say free blacks because there was slavery in New York. People generally think of that as a Southern institution. But slaves were instrumental in building New York in its early years. And in fact, the first people of African descent to actually set foot in Harlem were slaves of the Dutch in the 1650s. So slave labor was really instrumental in building New York and creating a lot of the wealth that was in this community. So by the end of the 1700s, slavery was beginning to be outlawed in New York. The process of gradual abolition began in 1799. By 1827, slavery is completely outlawed in New York State. Even prior to that time, though, you had a population of free blacks settling in the city, particularly down the 5 Points. So the 5 Points is significant to Harlem's history because some institutions that are now in Harlem actually got their start down in the 5 Points in the 1800s. Among them, St. Philip's Episcopal Church and Abyssinian Baptist Church, both founded down in the 5 Points in the 1800s, eventually migrated up to Harlem by the early 1900s. So over the course of the 1800s, the community moved up the west side of Manhattan. By the end of the 1800s, you had a settlement around 60th and 64th Street, where Lincoln Center is now. And that was a neighborhood that was nicknamed San Juan Hill. So in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were some African-American institutions in the neighborhood of San Juan Hill. But beginning in the 1900s, things began to shift into Harlem. And when it comes to the population of Harlem, the biggest source of people and one of the most important movements in its history is a movement that we call the Great Migration. And this was when millions of African Americans began to leave the South and settle in northern cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, and out west in places like Los Angeles. And there were many push and pull factors involved in this movement. People were getting away from exploitative sharecropping in the South. Remember, the South is still very much an agrarian economy run by a planter class that was interested in keeping the cheap labor source there in the South. And so many people were entrapped in very exploitative sharecropping situations in the South. And so people decided to make this move to the north. There were jobs in the north with industrialization and jobs related to industry. And so many African Americans began to move out of the South and settle in the north. To give you an idea of what we're talking about, between 1890 and 1930, in that 40-year span, 2 million blacks moved from the South to the north in that time, many more coming after them. In New York, at around 1900, the black population was about 60,000. And by 1930, it's 328,000. Many people coming right into Harlem. And so you see this confluence of forces we talked about. You have this population of people moving in the city, and then you had availability of housing in this newly developing neighborhood. However, this wasn't a smooth process. And in fact, many people who had already settled in Harlem, many of them white Americans, European immigrants beginning to settle in that neighborhood, didn't like the fact that there were blacks beginning to move into their neighborhood. And some actually formed what were known as covenant blocks. And these were agreements that they were not going to rent to any new black tenants on these particular blocks in Harlem. However, you could say that economic self-interest won out. Landlords began to realize that they could fill their buildings with black tenants. And this was before many equal opportunity housing laws were on the books that we have now. And so blacks were actually paying more for rent in Harlem than they would in other parts of the city. So essentially it is this process of overbuilding and population movement that led to the creation of the Harlem that we know today.
This is why we don't work with kids and animals.
My booty!